Network. CAN is a network of 2,000 civil society groups in over 150 countries. And on today's press briefing, we would like to bring to you the issues of human rights, the phase out of fossil fuels, and an update on the negotiations. So I would like to introduce our speakers in the interest of time and to get to questions as well. We will have opening remarks of about 4 minutes each, and then we will take questions from media. We have Dr. David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. We have Lily Four, Fossil Economy Director at the Center for International Environmental Law. We have Zaki Mamdou, Coordinator at the Stop COP campaign. And on my left is Iskander Erzini Vernoit, Co-founder and Director at the Imal Initiative for Climate and Development. So we will start with our first speaker. So I would invite Dr. Boyd to take the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us here this morning. Let's be crystal clear. The climate crisis is also a human rights crisis. We have new research published last week indicating there are 5 million premature deaths every year due to combustion of fossil fuels. There are hundreds of thousands of deaths each year from heat exposure, and that number is growing on an annual basis. We're seeing the spread of diseases like malaria, Zika, and dengue. We're seeing an increase in extreme weather events. And this climate crisis has profound impacts on human rights, including the right to life, the right to health, the right to water, the right to food, the rights of the child, cultural rights, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. As we sit here in this air-conditioned room in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, I think it is absolutely fundamental to keep at the forefront of our minds the billions of people who are suffering on a daily basis because of the climate crisis. I was in Botswana 2 months ago and I traveled to a remote indigenous community where the heat has become almost unbearable. Climate change is exacerbating water scarcity. Climate change is exacerbating human-wildlife conflict. It's exacerbating food insecurity. And this is a problem that has not been caused by the people of Botswana. It has been caused by the wealthy, high-emitting countries of the global north. Now, I'm a human rights expert, and one thing that frustrates me endlessly is that people do not understand that states have human rights obligations that are directly engaged by the climate crisis. Wealthy, high-emitting states have an obligation to phase out fossil fuels. They have an obligation to assist countries that are climate vulnerable with mitigation, adaptation, and wealthy, high-emitting states have an obligation to provide sufficient volumes of climate finance to address mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Here at COP28, we celebrate the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, and we mourn the fact that those wealthy, high-emitting countries are putting pennies in the jar, when what we need are hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And governments say, well, where will we get the money? I'll tell you where we can get the money. We can get the money by putting a carbon tax on every ton of fossil fuels that's burned in this world. A carbon tax of $30 per ton would raise over $1 trillion a year. Some of that would have to go to people in low-income communities to help them with the transition, but the lion's share of that money could be used for climate mitigation, adaptation, and compensation in the global south. So I know the time is short, but I want to just start with those comments, and I'll pass the microphone back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd, and I will invite Lily for her remarks.
Thank you. So thank you for those opening remarks. I can build on them. So I think these last few days, it's become really evident that participants here at COP28, all of us being massively distracted in at least 3 important ways that I would like to briefly point out. So the first distraction is that we have been drowned with declarations, pledges, and voluntary initiatives. So parties who've come here to really negotiate a meaningful outcome in good faith, and also observers in the media, should not fall for the sophisticated PR tactics that a massive army of PR advisors has put together. What we need are really binding commitments, not the empty promises and false solutions announced these last few days. And since it's Finance Day and we witnessed the relaunch of the Energy Transition Accelerator yesterday, let me clarify, carbon markets are not climate finance, even if you call them carbon finance. Some initiatives that we've seen over the last couple of days, like the Global Decarbonization Accelerator, create a false equivalence between things that are really not the same thing. Some are really important, the scaling of renewable energies, Others are greenwashing, so promotion of oil and gas industry decarbonization through carbon capture and storage. The second massive distraction, so this is about the fossil fuel phase out. So the call and case for a phase out of fossil fuels, full, fair, fast, forever, and funded, has never really been greater than right now. The writing is on the wall. But the fossil fuel interests are doing all they can to distract us from that really important and urgent task by proposing technological fixes like carbon capture and storage, CCS, or blue or clean hydrogen. So when the CEOs of major oil and gas companies come to COP28 to sell the idea of carbon capture as a climate solution, we must remember we cannot abate fossil fuels. We can not simply manage their emissions or manage the carbon. The IPCC has made it crystal clear the only meaningful way to tackle fossil fuels is to stop producing and using them, period. So a successful energy package here in Dubai must close the door very firmly for new fossil fuel investments and subsidies, some of which come under the disguise of carbon management, abatement technologies, or low-carbon fossil gas, hydrogen, or ammonia. And the last distraction I want to point out, it has to do with how this is playing out in the negotiations around a global stocktake. What we're seeing is the risk of a very bloated, basically meaningless global stocktake text with no operational purpose. A reminder, the purpose of the global stocktake is really to enhance ambition. And the next round of NDCs is just around the corner. Many of those will look at the period from 2025 to 35. So that's a period where many or most industrialized countries that are most responsible will have to get very close to zero fossil fuel emissions already. So we really need clear guidance on phasing out fossil fuels for that time window. That's crucially important. We cannot afford to leave any doubt in that guidance, any wriggle room or any loopholes or reliance on dangerous distractions like offsets or CCS. So we know what the NDC synthesis says. We also know how much climate finance is missing. There have been report after report, assessment after assessment, pointing to the staggering gap between what's needed and what is being done here. So a global stocktake decision without clear guidance on how to phase out fossil fuels would be a massive distraction and a massive missed opportunity. So parties need to maintain control over those negotiations at this crucial moment in time. We have more than 100 countries really who've joined the call for a phase out of fossil fuels. We also have a handful of countries willing to do all they can to prevent just that. So the willingness of a government like the US government, one of the largest planet wreckers with massive expansion plans, both for oil and gas, but also for dangerous distractions like CCS, they're only really ready to engage on this by talking about the phase out of unabated fossil fuels. And that really speaks to the emptiness of that promise and aligns with the attempts of the COP presidency to introduce red herring after red herring to distract us. We're not really surprised by the unwillingness of some countries here to commit to real climate action or by the eagerness of others to promote these false solutions. But no matter what happens here in Dubai, and building on what David already said, what we're seeing is in human rights bodies and in courts around the world is really that regardless of what governments say or don't say here at COP, governments have the duty to protect human rights and the right to a healthy environment. They have binding commitments through national and international law. The hallways and pavilions here at COP28 are flooding with fossil fuel lobbyists. They're trying to turn it into a fossil fuel, a festival of false solutions. So the fossil fuel industry knows the days are numbered. We know what needs to be done. We know what needs to be agreed on, and with only 9 days to go, our patience is really running low. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. And now over to Zaki.
Thank you. As we sit here today, and as world leaders and policymakers gather in the comforts of boardrooms and conference venues, negotiating the future of our world itself, 7 Ugandan student activists sit in prison cells in Kampala. On the 24th of November, they took to the streets to peacefully petition the Ugandan government to hear the demands of communities and of young people who are calling for Total Energy's destructive East African crude oil pipeline project, or the EACOP project, to be stopped. In response to the extreme harm that this project is set to cause to the natural world, and in a show of resistance to the dispossession, the violence, and the social and cultural and unraveling that the project has already caused 100 communities along its route, These young people and brave student activists have come out to assert themselves as legitimate stakeholders in the developmental trajectory of their country. And that is their crime. Following their arrest on the 24th of November, the state prosecutor failed to appear in court, and they were remanded to the Luzira maximum security prison, where they sit in concrete cells at this very moment, with a few even missing their graduation ceremonies. Yesterday, while checking on the status and well-being of our young comrades through a legal support team who has access to them, one of the students, Wafula Simon, reported, and I quote, he said very simply, that there's nothing to be worried about, for we are activists fighting against injustice. Now, of course, his words are untrue, because indeed, there is a lot to be worried about. But nonetheless, those words echo a resounding courage, conviction and commitment which can only be put forward by those whose sense of justice is so clear that they need not question whether history will judge them poorly. The courage and conviction that these student activists portray is something that they share with many who have come before them, as well as many who can be counted among them today. Activists, community members, faith leaders, mothers, ordinary people with extraordinary hearts in the face of repression. And across the global south, and especially on the front lines, land and environmental defenders are being surveilled, harassed, intimidated, brutalized, imprisoned, and assassinated. Global Witness has reported that between 2012 and 2022, there have been close to 2,000 environmental defenders who have been murdered, with the vast majority of these killings going unpunished. In South Africa, we count the names of Bazuka Radebe and Mamfikile and Chingase among those who have been assassinated in the last 10 years alone. We also know that this is not a new phenomenon, and that there are many more. We still remember, for example, the contributions of Ken Saro Wiwa, who was sentenced to death in 1995 after leading a movement to protect the human and environmental rights of the Ogoni people in Nigeria, whose oil-rich land was being exploited by multinational corporations. These assassinations do not happen in isolation, but are situated on the extreme end of an incredibly concerning trend involving the widespread and ongoing silencing of activists and community voices, and the denial of their human rights and basic freedoms. It is also not just repressive regimes and state actors who are responsible for the violence which defenders are subjected to. We know too well the ways in which the strong arm of the fossil fuel industry protects its interests with a brutality that knows no bounds, whether it is through bribery, co-option, direct intimidation, the employment of mercenary security personnel, or through calling in political favors and essentially getting the police forces to serve as a private army to protect the interests of capital. Multinational corporations are often directly involved in the violence upon which the fossil fuel industry has built its dystopian empire. Perhaps I'll stop there and wait for questions. We'll come back to it.
Thank you so much, Zaki. And now our final speaker, Iskander.
Thank you very much, Darini. So my name is Iskander, and I'll be speaking about finance. I think it can only be stressed that the climate crisis is a matter of, is a crisis of finance. We have around the world countries that have put in painstaking efforts to develop plans for climate mitigation, adaptation, and responding to loss and damage. But in many cases, in most cases, these are unfunded in their totality. We're at a time of exceptional economic crises, one of the worst debt crises since the 1980s and the early 2000s. The crisis that we're in is reflective of the fact that we have unmet commitments. The commitments of the developed countries under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as under the Paris Agreement and the decisions from COP29, have not been fulfilled, notably the 100 billion. We find ourselves now at COP28 at a time when we're supposed to undertake the global stocktake on various matters, including on finance, understood as referred to as the means of implementation in the negotiations process. But of course, this is a recurring issue across the global stocktake of work on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. On all fronts, we are seeing a fearsome lack of finance, a shortfall which grows with every year in which unmet gaps are piled on to subsequent years. We've seen a number of pledges being made by developed countries and even some wealthier developing countries, notably around the Loss and Damage Fund, but there have been others as well. To this, we would urge caution, because these pledges are not necessarily additional, and this is of vital importance to understand, because in some cases, the funds that are being announced to go to loss and damage are effectively being taken away from funding that might go for climate adaptation, for instance, or wider development finance objectives and the SDGs. This is unacceptable, given the commitment historically that climate finance be additional. And so definitely a word of caution in that regard with respect to these commitments. But this is why, and this is something that was mandated in Paris, the negotiations are underway to develop a new collective quantified goal to replace the 100 billion. This is something which is meant to be finalized at COP29. And so therefore COP28 is the final COP in this journey, and it represents a critical moment in that respect. We now have a draft text that was released on the new collective quantified goal decision for this year, and it's under negotiation, but there's a lot of unanswered questions there. And I think the matters in particular that might be potentially agreed this year with respect to this new goal are purely some of the basic questions around how it might be structured, what the time frame that would apply to it would be, and other matters, not the quantum, which would be a decision for next year. But suffice to say that finance is recurring quite a bit in negotiations on specific topics. Notably the Just Transition Work Program, the Global Goal on Adaptation, and other areas. In many of these instances, I think the question is how they, as processes, will relate to the process around the new collective quantified goal. So yeah, I think I'll stop there in the interest of time, and happy to take questions after.
Thank you so much, Iskander, and thank you to all our speakers. We can now take questions from the floor. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll take two together. So I see two at the back there, and then I'll come to the one in front. Please hand over the mic.
Hi, I'm Mike Fouché from Energy News Network. This is for Ms. Fur. Ms. Fur, can you give us a sense of how you think the comments made by the COP president yesterday about the validity of climate science impacts the actual negotiations, or is that simply a distraction?
Thank you for that question. So my understanding is that the remarks that there was published yesterday, the remarks were made that you're referring to a couple of days ago, not right at COP, so it was published then. I think this speaks to the fact that we have seen this COP presidency trying for many months actually already, trying to distract from the very core issue that this COP has to deal with the phase out of fossil fuels. We've seen various attempts to rephrase it as, some of you might have been at Bonn at the climate negotiations in June, where we saw a big attempt to phrase it as, let's deal with the emissions of fossil fuels. That would be enough. And this is coming in new disguise again and again, but the science is clear. I mean, I think, if you read the IPCC report, those reports are crystal clear that the only hope we have of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is to rapidly and fully phase out fossil fuels as soon as possible. And there is no doubt about that, and it's concerning that the presidency communicates these doubts. But I think he has received already strong pushback from various climate scientists involved in the writing of these reports. So I think the majority, like most of us, are pretty clear about that. And I think parties just need to concentrate on the urgent task ahead and not get distracted by those false promises and claims.
Thank you so much. So we'll take two questions together. There was one from there. Please hand over to you, the blue shirt. Yes.
Hello, my question is for Zaki.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Agnes Hall. I work for 350.org. My question is for Zaki. Can you tell us, is Total Energies involved in the repression of the ECOP activists? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question here from the front. Here, please, to this, yeah.
Hi, I'm Nina Lakhani from The Guardian. It's a question for David. I just wondered what conclusions you would draw from the insistence of rich nations to not have human rights included in the loss and damage language, and what could the consequences be? Obviously, there's, it's great that the fund is there and it's being operationalised, but human rights is absent. And what do you fear the consequences of that might be?
Thank you. So we'll take these two questions. Zaki, you can start.
Sure. So, look, the short answer is yes. Total, in our view, is directly involved. In fact, there's a Global Witness report that is set to come out later today, in which they've done an investigation, and it implicates Total in being party to the bullying and intimidation of communities which are affected by the ECOP project. And community members have reported feeling pressured into compensation deals, dispossessing them of their land. The investigation also found evidence that suggests that Total was in communication with Ugandan state actors prior to threats and arrests of anti-oil campaigners and activists. So just if I can throw in two concluding remarks quickly. As we sit here in this COP, it's an imperative that we demand that these injustices and those responsible for them are brought to book. We have said very clearly that there is no climate justice without human rights, and so we need the lived experiences and the testimonies of our communities to be central, in central considerations in the negotiation process and in negotiating the character of a just transition. Unfortunately, but also unsurprisingly, this is not happening. It cannot happen when time and time again the voices of our communities are excluded from these spaces and excluded from formal decision-making, confined to the fringes and the outskirts with limitations on what can and can't be said, while the fossil fuel lobbyists and government actors flirt their way ever closer to our demise. So we have to change this and find ways to center restorative justice in these negotiations. And in this, we ask all of you, members of the press, organizations, and all freedom-loving people who are here to join us in calling for the immediate release and unconditional release of the 7 Ugandan student activists who are sitting in the Luzira maximum security prison. But we also ask you to amplify and elevate the testimonies of land, human rights, and environmental defenders across the global south. We ask you to support in the development of frameworks and mechanisms which uphold the agency and aspirations of communities as we seek to phase out fossil fuels entirely and power up renewables. And we ask you to find in you the same courage that sits in the hearts of those Ugandan student activists and so many others, so that we can all be unapologetic in our demand for justice and work to bring a complete end to the violence that defenders are exposed to and prevent the criminalization of those who peacefully assert their legitimate stake in our world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zaki. Dr. Boyd.
Thanks. I think it's ironic that the states of the global north that portray themselves as champions of human rights are the very ones opposing the inclusion of human rights language time after time again at these climate conferences. Ideally, we should have strong human rights language in these documents. There was reference to human rights in the preamble of the outcome statement from Sharm el-Sheikh. There's a reference to human rights in the preamble of the draft text of the global stocktake. It's nice to have that language, but in reality, The human rights obligations of the wealthy global states exist regardless of whether or not they're reiterated in these climate documents. And those obligations are crystal clear, which is why those governments have this paradoxical hypocrisy when it comes to human rights. Around the world, I think it's important to recognize that one of the reasons that the United Nations Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement have failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the past 31 years is that there are no accountability or enforcement mechanisms in those international environmental laws. Human rights law brings accountability and enforcement, which is why these wealthy northern states fear it. But human rights are being used in courtrooms around the world by civil society, by indigenous people, by communities of color and communities living in poverty, are using their human rights to hold governments accountable, youth as well. So in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Colombia, Brazil, we have seen courts hold governments accountable for their human rights obligations in the context of climate change, forcing governments to reduce emissions more quickly. And this is a pattern that has begun in those countries I mentioned and will only continue to grow as governments drag their heels on urgent climate action to address this emergency. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of our time here. So if you had a question you would have liked to ask the panel, I'm hopeful they can stay a little bit behind, take those questions outside the room. I want to thank all of you for being here and all our speakers, and we'll be back here tomorrow again at 11:30, and also to give an update on the negotiations taking place today and tomorrow. Thank you.
For being here for this half-an-hour session that talks about opportunities for the Greater Bay Area Climate Cooperation. We're really honored to have on stage with us on my left side the Commissioner C.F. Wong from Hong Kong, who is the Climate Commissioner, and on his left, Chair David Hawkshaw, Chair of California Energy Commission. So welcome, Commissioner Wong and Chair Hawkshaw. I would like to maybe start by by asking Chair Hawkshaw to introduce to us what California is doing in terms of advancing its clean energy technology solutions and policy, and how you see California in this rapid decarbonization and energy transition to achieve carbon neutrality. Chair Hawkshaw.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Fan, and thank you for all the work that you do at the China-California Climate Institute to be a bridge builder in terms of climate solutions and climate collaboration. It's something we need more than ever. I think in many ways the relationship between the United States and China, and California and China in particular, is the most important